Zut alors,
Hey, Monsieur Rad.
comment ça va?
Very well. And yourself, Kevin?
Pardon, je suis en retard.
Pas de problème. How come your French is so good? Have you been taking lessons?
Mais non,
Or have you been talking to Mr. Macron?
mais oui.
That's what it is. Very good. I see that both of us have grown a little beard.
Yeah. I'm trying to emulate Hemingway.
Oh, that's what it is. But I'm
So-
not sure who I'm emulating. But I left a beard. I have not. Well, I am shaving, but really with a special razor since my mother passed away. You know, that's in commemoration of her passing. Anyway,
No.
Kevin, it's good to see you. How is Therese?
Oh, she's good. I'm in Sydney. She's in Brisbane. And so,
And I believe that you are the recipient of the tyranny of bureaucracy. You had a 72 hours lockdown as you come back from Singapore.
that's right.
Are you still in the quarantine?
Yeah. So I've just had my test. So assuming I'm okay, then I'll be out later today. That should be good.
So it's surprising. Former prime ministers don't get a special treatment.
Non, c'est l'Australie. C'est naturel.
Dear. So Kevin, first of all, thank you for doing this. It's good to have you back at the dialogue. Of course, you were with us in you hosted the dialogue in 2009 when we did it in Australia, and you were very kind of providing us with an amazing security, which was embarrassing, actually, because we had the Vice Prime Minister of Israel, Silvan Shalom, and a huge delegation from Israel. So wherever we went, we had helicopters overhead. I mean, it was just ridiculous. I'll never do this again. And you know, the demonstrations were ridiculous as well. So we learned the lesson, but since then we've been doing it only in Jerusalem, and once we did it in London. And then we hosted you in Jerusalem, but then that was as a foreign minister in 2011. And if you recall, we had a delegation from Australia that included all the family of William Cooper. And we did...
They came to Yad Vashem.
Exactly. We did something at Yad Vashem in commemoration for his bravery. And people watching this, if they don't know who William Cooper was and what act of bravery he did, I invite them to simply Google that. But since that time, we have not had the pleasure to see you at the dialogue. And therefore, I welcome you back today. And there's a lot happening in the world, Kevin. It's not the same world as 10 years ago, far from it. 10 years ago, we thought we lived in a crazy world. We had no idea that where the trajectory would take us to here, and I don't know where it's going to take us to in the next 10 years. But I'd like to remind our members and everyone who watches this that you presided as the Prime Minister of Australia at the time to the biggest financial crisis of our time, which was known as the financial crisis in 2008. And you did exceptionally well because you provided a guarantee to the banks in Australia, basically a government guarantee that calmed the market down, because the volatility and the trust between financial institutions had evaporated, and you restored that confidence that enabled this country to cruise smoothly and start to recover. So why am I saying this? Because to me, what seemed to be very important to you and to everyone in government at the time, and I would say both the opposition and the government, was the fiscal responsibility and how important the economy is, and how you were able to balance all competing interests at hand. And if you fast forward to this pandemic, we see exactly the opposite. It seems that the economy doesn't count, doesn't matter at all, and the debt has no limit. So my question to you is, how would you have managed this pandemic if you were the prime minister? And I don't mean you ordering vaccines earlier than what has happened and so on. I mean, would you have managed fiscally in the same way? Would you have allowed the states to close their borders in contravention of, I believe, Section 92 of the Australian Constitution, and extended by the High Court by further cases in the 80s, and so on? I mean, it seems to me that values have been compromised, and I'm just very curious as to what your view is and what you would have done instead of what we've experienced.
Well, thank you, Albert, and greetings to all of our friends in Israel, and also to the Jewish community in Australia and the United Kingdom, and of course around the world. I've been a lifelong friend of Israel. Never precluded me from having disagreements with the Israeli government of the day, but a lifelong friend of the nation state of Israel. It's always easy in international and national political leadership to have 20/20 hindsight. I don't claim to have that in relation to the current crisis. The core point I'd make is that each crisis is different, but there are similarities between these two crises. In the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010, it began as a financial crisis and became a general economic crisis. In the case of this crisis, it has begun as a public health crisis, which has become an economic crisis, but has not yet become a financial crisis. And it's important to have our analysis clear. Our principal objective in 2009 was to do two things. One was to stabilize financial institutions so that we would not have a collapse of confidence, as well as to keep the arteries of credit flowing. And we took those decisions mindful of that objective, and they were very large decisions and very controversial at the time, to provide a public guarantee for all Australia's private financial institutions, and to provide a guarantee also for their international lines of credit, particularly from the capital markets in the United States and elsewhere. The second line of response was to do with the real economy, having achieved our first, which was to prevent any single Australian financial institution from collapsing. And in the general economy, we took an analysis of what we thought and were advised would be the contraction in overall demand. Our objective in policy was to avoid a recession, because recessions result in deep scarring, long-term scarring of both society and the economy. And so therefore we had to temporarily use public demand to fill the gap left by private demand. And therefore the stimulus strategy we adopted was short, sharp, temporary, and targeted. And if you look at the data 10 years later, you will see an intense activity in 2009 and a tailoring down of that activity in 10 and 11. And so if you're looking at the graph, it was like that. Boom, boom. And the overall injection into GDP from fiscal borrowings and fiscal stimulus ultimately added up to around 5 to 6% of GDP. It was one of the larger ones in the developed world at the time, but it was also highly temporary and highly targeted. And we had a fiscal exit strategy already legislated to have us out of borrowing and into surplus by around about 2014. My criticism of what has flowed with the economic response to the current COVID crisis is at three levels. The first is, as you probably recall, at the end of 2019, before COVID hit, the Australian economy was already slowing and weakening badly. But because the government then was ideologically committed for domestic political reasons to deliver a surplus, budget surplus, in order to badge itself as responsible fiscal managers, even though the debt we accumulated in the global financial crisis was modest by international standards. The result was that the Australian government then failed to intervene by loosening fiscal policy in late 19, which is what the Reserve Bank of Australia was calling upon it to do. Therefore, we entered the COVID crisis in a weaker state than we needed to. The second mistake, in my judgment, was that the measures embraced were not sufficiently targeted. The broad-based approach to what I would describe as the JobKeeper policy has, by various estimates, resulted in $20 to $30 billion worth of corporate welfare to corporations who did not, at the end of the day, experience any radical deterioration in their bottom line circumstances. Had that been our government committing $26 billion plus in unnecessary corporate welfare, all hell will have rained down upon us politically, but it didn't. My third critique, and the one I'm most concerned about, is that here we are in the end of calendar year 2021, looking towards the 2022 budget, and as yet, there is not even the slightest attempt at a fiscal repair strategy by the current government. At the end of the day, as you know, Albert, money doesn't grow on trees. Whatever central banks tell us about the infinite qualities of quantitative easing, at the end of the day, you still need to bring about a fiscal balance within the economic or business cycle. There is no evidence yet of any strategy to reconsolidate public finance in Australia. That would be my third criticism in terms of the government's overall economic policy response.
Very good. And do you think that if there was an Albanese government elected at the next election, what do you think? There would be a fiscally responsible government? How do you see them?
I think given that they are from the Labor Party, and given the critique of all incoming Labor governments is that, unfairly in my judgment, is that because they lack a business constituency, they're therefore going to be looser in financial and economic policy settings. My judgment politically is that what the incoming Labor government would do would be to adopt a significant fiscal repair strategy. In fact, I believe that the political opportunity for the Labor Party lies in being more fiscally corrective of current budget policy settings than the current Morrison-Frydenberg government, which I increasingly regard as being fiscally irresponsible. So I am not a member of this alternative government, but I know the personalities quite well. And I think the predisposition will in fact be to adopt a cautious consolidating approach, not least because of the external political critique, not least, however, because of the depth of the public indebtedness in which we now find ourselves. To put it into context, Albert, when we, in the elections of 2010 and 2013, when I went to the election against the Conservatives, our budget deficit in 2013 was 1/5 that of what it is today. And our overall net debt to GDP was also 1/5 of what it is today. Therefore, for those reasons, I think both against the objective record and also for the contemporary political circumstances I just referred to, I think an incoming Labor government would adopt a cautious consolidating approach to the fiscal balance.
It would be quite an opposite world, because in years past, the liberals were the conservatives, and they were the one tightening. And whenever Labour came in, they were exercising largesse. But here we are talking about something completely, in my view, outside of the norm. I mean, we are approaching now a 50% debt to GDP ratio in Australia. I mean, if you compare that to France, I think the French are 110%, the Americans are at around 100%. So you could argue that Australia, in relative terms, is still doing okay. But we came from near zero in your time to the 50% in 10 years. So that trend has to be backed. We have to do everything we can to back to normality. And I certainly hope that if there is a Labour government coming, that they've got that in front of their mind. Because
I think the other thing to bear in mind, though, Albert, is that in the history of the Hawke and Keating government, it was a financially highly disciplined government. If you look at the history of budget balance and budget repair during that period, it consistently outperformed the previous Fraser government, and by and large was deeply fiscally responsible when measured against the record of the subsequent Howard government as well. I think the second thing to say is, absent the global financial crisis, our own financial strategy going into 07 and 8 and 9 again is a highly conservative one, particularly on the question of controlling government outlays. If you look at the growth of expenditure during the period, our period in office, annual expenditure growth minus the fiscal stimulus necessary from the global financial crisis was modest against Howard government norms, and certainly has been highly modest against subsequent Liberal Party government norms. So I think the tradition and the historical record is more robust than you've suggested. Again, I would simply say that when we left office, debt to GDP stood at 13%, okay, and was to peak at 16%.
Well, that's quite a long distance that we traveled since. And you're right to correct me, because effectively the Keating and the Keating years were fiscally definitely responsible. I recall going through them, except for that one comment that costed us a lot of money, as you recall, about the Banana Republic. But that's a different story.
That was Keating's warning to the general economy to embrace systemic reform, otherwise you'd end up as Argentina and Brazil.
That's correct.
Think it had a salutary effect, though it may have cost your business operations at the time. I'm not sure.
Yes. But anyway, that's too far in history for what the agenda I have for today, because I really want to talk about our current issues that I think are greater than the ones we faced historically. So we were talking about the economy, and of course, one thing that is facing the federal government currently that is kind of a new challenge is that there is a rise of power within the states, which we have not seen before. Anyway, in my time in Australia, I have not seen the state being as powerful as they are today. And you can be, as a federal government, fiscally responsible, but if the states are not, that's an issue, because ultimately you've got the same voters. And so, for instance, in Victoria, we are, by the way, here in Melbourne, where I sit, we are the city in the world that has been in, we have the record of lockdown in the world. It's not a proud one. And the amount of debt that the Victorian government has accumulated is staggering. Of course, there has to be a reaction federally. If they had starved the Victorian government, they would be basically starving their electorate as well. And so there is this power play between state and federal that I've never seen before. What do you think of this, and what do you think of these new powers that the states have? Is that a surprise to you? Did you see it coming? What's the way out of here?
Well, I think we always have to go back to the constitutional arrangements in this country. Australia is a federation, and within the federation, the residual powers are vested in the states. It's the specifically allocated constitutional powers which are vested in the Commonwealth. So on the fiscal power that you've referred to, as well as the loan-raising power, as a consequence of our federal arrangements and changes in the 1930s and changes as a consequence of the war powers in 1942, the fiscal taxing power of the Commonwealth increased radically against the intention of the founding fathers in 1901. Secondly, through the loan council arrangements, the federal government also has power to impose limits on the aggregate quantum of state government loan raising. What we've seen in the deterioration of the Australian public financial accounts in the last decade has occurred as a consequence of actions by the federal government. On the state contribution, yes, it has been part of the equation, but to be fair, in the overall mathematics of it, there's not the dominant part of the equation. I'm not in a position to comment on the state of Victoria's individual public finances. I don't have those numbers in front of me. The second point, though, is the health power has always been a residual state power. And therefore, health and hospitals has clearly always lain with the states. I know this acutely because 2010, I chaired a national reform program for the National Health and Hospitals Network of Australia, which was the biggest single set of reforms to the health and hospital system since Medicare was introduced. But the ultimate powers are held by the states. Therefore, when you've got a public health emergency, except where it involves quarantine and vaccine and the approval of medicines, the actual running of the health systems to deal with a public health crisis lies with the states. And the various public health ordinances which you've seen issued by the states have been entirely constitutional. Were it not constitutional, let me tell you, the federal government will have challenged this in the court a long time ago and with a view to winning such a case. The fact that they did not challenge it meant that their legal advisors were strongly of the view that the states retained these powers. The real question, I think, Albert, is how could you have made the federation work better? The National Cabinet, so-called, is in fact largely a public relations exercise on the part of Prime Minister Morrison. It is an opportunity to demonstrate the appearance of national leadership while not actually delivering the substance of national leadership. We had already established 30 years ago a mechanism called the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, which was there for the specific purpose of ensuring that the federal and state governments were cooperating. It had a standing committee of health ministers. All that machinery should have been immediately deployed and operated in a substantive and cooperative and collaborative way, rather than a manner which was largely driven by a political and public relations agenda to give the impression that the federal government, quote, was in control of the pandemic agenda, unquote, whereas the reality was, at least for the first 6 to 9 months, is that they were not. Look at the record on quarantine, look at the record on vaccine. So in retrospect, I would have deployed the COAG machinery, used the Standing Committee of Health Ministers, and made sure it worked on a rolling, regular, collaborative basis, rather than creating an artificial piece of political machinery, which I think has been largely for cosmetic public relations and domestic electoral consumption.
Thank you, Kevin. If my memory serves me well, you graduated from a Taiwan universities.
I didn't graduate from Taiwan University, but I did study at what's called the Taiwan Normal University at the Language Training Center, the Mandarin Language Training Center. In Chinese, it's Taiwan Shifang Guoli Daxue, Guoyu Zhongxin. And that was way back in the Mesolithic period. That's when I learned Chinese.
And Was I mistaken? I thought that you graduated from the Sun Yat-sen University. Is that the one?
No, no, it's a different one. And I didn't do a full university course. I simply did a short-term language course there. My studies in Chinese language, literature and history were at the Australian National University in Canberra. So I went to Taiwan to brush up my spoken Mandarin.
So what do you think of Keating's statement the other day at the press club, where he said that Australia doesn't have a vital interest in Taiwan? Do you agree with that statement?
It sounds like you're asking a question on behalf of News Corporation, Albert.
Why? Not at all. I'm asking a question on my own behalf.
My approach to Taiwan has always been pretty plain, and that is any scenarios in the future concerning an Australian or American military commitment to Taiwan should be evaluated at the time based on the circumstances. The United States administration, under multiple US presidents, Republican and Democrat, have maintained a posture of what's called strategic ambiguity. That means that they will not commit in advance to a military defense of Taiwan explicitly. And the reason for doing so is that they want to cause the Taiwanese political system to be cautious about how they approach their relationship with mainland China. And for the Taiwanese centre-left party, the DPP in particular, to be dissuaded from issuing any universal or unilateral declaration of independence. If, for example, the independentists assumed that they would automatically command American military support and broader allied support. At the same time, that ambiguity is designed towards a Beijing audience to cause the PRC to conclude that they should equally be uncertain about whether the Americans would militarily intervene or not. In other words, the logic or the strategic logic underpinning it has been well entrenched for many decades. Similarly, successive Australian governments, both Liberal and Labor, have adopted the same posture. That is, not to commit in advance as to what our obligations would be under any given scenarios in the future over Taiwan. Both sides of Australian politics are robust in their commitment to the US alliance. Both sides of Australian politics admire the achievements of democracy within Taiwan, and both sides of Australian politics have maintained a bipartisan consensus on diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China. The only person in recent history who's departed from that consensus has been Dutton, and his recent statements of unequivocal military support by Australia towards Taiwan. There he stands in complete contradistinction to the Howard government, to the Fraser government, to the Turnbull government, to the Abbott government, and prior to that, to the Menzies government on the question of Taiwan. This has been a unique statement, and I think stands alone in terms of the history of both American and Australian heads of government, foreign ministers, and defense ministers.
So it's interesting because Australia is in a course in a path with China that may not end well. Do you agree with that?
Well, Chinese strategy towards Taiwan is becoming increasingly militarist. If you're an analyst of Chinese politics and foreign policy on the broader question of Taiwan, as well as its military preparedness for hard military action against Taiwan, since Xi Jinping has come to power, but prior to that as well, the level of military preparedness has increased year by year. So much so that China's military strategy appears to be one aimed at altering the balance of power in the Taiwan Straits to the extent that if there was a future military crisis, for example, engineered by Beijing, that the change in the balance of power would be such as to dissuade any chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States to advise the United States president at the time to militarily intervene for fear of losing. China's strategy, therefore, is pretty clear. Apply maximum political and foreign policy leverage on Taiwan its domestic politics in order to cause Taiwan to agree to some form of federation with China, or confederation with China, or some form of political union with China on the basis of one country, two systems. And failing that, a military coercive strategy for which they are simultaneously preparing. Therefore, the overall trajectory on Taiwan, as you said before, Albert, is not a positive one. It's a negative one. But that does not of itself justify a change in long-standing American, Australian, and broader allied strategy on commenting on individual scenarios concerning Taiwan in the future. They would need to be judged against the circumstances of the time.
Yes. And Kevin, what do you think of the current strategy that Australia is following vis-a-vis of China? As you know, since the beginning of this pandemic, we have our Prime Minister who wanted to find the origin of the virus, and that tickled the tiger, and it has never calmed down ever since. So you think China is overreacting with Australia? What is the strategy behind all of this?
Well, it takes two to tango. Chinese actions, not just in relation to the United States, not just in relation to Australia, but in relation to all US allies and many non-allies as well, for the last 7 years or so has become increasingly assertive, increasingly hardline, increasingly uncompromising in the prosecution of what it perceives to be China's national interests and national values. You see that in the South China Sea against the Philippines and Vietnam. You see it on the Taiwan Straits, as we've just discussed. You see it in the East China Sea in relation to Japan. You see it on the Sino-Indian border in relation to India. And you see it in cyber and in space. You also see it in various forms of what we would describe as coercive economic diplomacy on the part of China. My overall point here is that, Albert, is that Australia is not Robinson Crusoe. Australia is not alone. All other countries in the region go through similar experiences. What makes Australia different is that what I find difficult to identify in Canberra is a coherent, enduring China strategy on the part of the Morrison government. What I see is the continued conflation of two sets of interests. One is a rolling electoral strategy on the part of Mr. Morrison and Mr. Dutton and others to look hairy-chested in their response to Beijing. But secondly, on the actual operational characteristics of that strategy, it's very hard for me to determine what actually it is, other than sounding tough. That's about it, as opposed to an operational strategy which seeks to maximize our interests and our values in dealing with China. So I'm the first one to accept that the China relationship, whoever is in power in Canberra at present, would be difficult to prosecute. It was difficult when I was in office, and we were much criticized at the time, as you may recall, for being too hardline on China then by our conservative opponents, including Mr. Abbott and others. And I would be fully accepting of the fact that if I was Prime Minister today, it would be a difficult relationship to manage. However, there should be some common principles here which are enduring. We should be clear with China in our declaratory statements and our operational strategy that we accept universal human rights norms. Secondly, we should be clear in our declaratory strategy and our operational behavior that we are a 100-year-long ally of the United States. Thirdly, we should be clear that we want to maximize our trading relationship with China and our investment relationship within national security constraints. Fourthly, we should indicate to China that we wish to maximally collaborate with China in the institutions of global governance like the G20, including in areas such as climate change. And fifthly, I think where Morrison went wrong on the public health crisis coming out of the pandemic and the attribution of blame was that if you are going to take a sharp position on the origins of the virus, and I have no problems with that, if you're the Prime Minister of Australia, you should do so in company with a dozen other countries of size and substance around the world, rather than unilaterally freewheel. The smart thing to do in diplomacy is to act in partnership with others rather than simply act alone for domestic look-at-me sort of purposes. In terms of the call for an investigation of the origins of the virus, and there was nothing remarkable or wrong with that. In fact, I co-authored an article in the New York Times with 100 other signatories around the world, issuing the same demand several weeks before Mr. Morrison ever opened his mouth. The key thing, though, is that I was in partnership with 100 other people, mainly Americans, in making that request. Mr. Morrison, for electoral purposes here in Australia, chose to make his statement unilaterally. That, I think, was part of the problem. So if you're going to disagree with Beijing, my fifth principle is do so in the company of others rather than seeking to do so unilaterally by yourself. It just makes sense.
If I may also add to what you just said, Kevin, during the last 10 years, we had a great commercial relationship with China, but it was one that was one-sided. Like there was a price tag on everything in Australia, and the Chinese were coming and purchasing. Of course, the reciprocal approach was not true. We could not invest or develop in China without a Chinese partner, but they could come and do whatever they wanted here in Australia. So I give you a very simple example. We sold them the port of Darwin, for crying out loud. It's a strategic port that was sold to the Chinese, where now the government is searching for ways to walk that back. Good luck with that. But we did that in the development industries, where, you know, I'm a developer and I developed many, many buildings. And then suddenly I couldn't afford the land anymore because the Chinese were prepared to pay 4 or 5 times the price of what I used to pay, and etc. So suddenly we are reacting in a way that we're realizing that the laissez-faire has gone a little bit too far, and now we're walking all of that back. And it's a hard push. Do you think there's a bit of that going?
Well, in the economic relationship, a few things should be said. One is, if you look at the average statistics of the economic relationship, during our 6 years in office, the economic relationship continued to go from strength to strength, and with the balance of trade definitely in Australia's favour, despite the fact that we had many political disagreements with Beijing at the time. The bottom line was we managed our political disagreements in a more effective way because we did not seek to turn them into a Barnum and Bailey circus act in Australian domestic politics every day of the week, because that, I think, is the hallmark of the current government. The second point I'd make is this. From the Howard government, we inherited free trade negotiations with the Chinese for an Australia-China free trade agreement. And we spent 6 years trying to bring this to conclusion, and we failed. And that's because China refused to yield on core clauses in the agreement, which maximized Australian economic sovereignty. Mr. Abbott, in a very determined push to demonstrate that he could, quote, do China, unlike the so-called China expert, Prime Minister Rudd, within about 12 months of his becoming Prime Minister in 2014, they signed and sealed this bilateral FTA. That involved Australia capitulating in a whole series of areas where previous Australian governments, both the Howard government and my government, had refused to concede. And so therefore, I think that was a bad step because it created an unequal set of relationships. Thirdly, that particularly applied to the nature of, shall we say, incoming foreign direct investment. You just referred to that. And when you therefore had an ability for large amounts of Chinese inbound capital to flood the Australian property market, it was going to create its own imbalances, and it subsequently did. But that was the economic price which Abbott was prepared to pay in order to secure the political advantages he perceived at the time of being able to do a free trade agreement with Beijing, even though my government and the Howard government had refused to do so.
AUKUS. That happened after your time, happened about AUKUS started 2 or 3 years ago, and resulted in the famous submarine deal that we just observed. We as Australian took away the submarine deal that Christopher Pyne signed with the French, and given it to the Americans and our UK friends. Leaving aside the morality of the deal, that has created definite frictions between France and Australia. But also, it's interesting to observe how Biden has been treating Australia post that deal. Like at the G7 recently, I saw a snippet on TV where Biden turned around to Macron and said, "I didn't know this." Like he did not know that the deal had actually been cancelled officially with the French prior of him signing a new deal with Australia. So by doing so, I felt that Australia has been thrown under the bus. What do you think of Biden's reaction? Do you think that's believable? And what do you think of that deal in general? I know you've written an article that was widely reported in Le Monde in French, but I'm asking you for the record for our members what you think of that deal.
Yeah, I've written several things on this and generally China's strategy, both in Le Monde, Le Point, as well as Die Zeit and Der Spiegel in Germany, because as you know, Albert, as a European yourself, a European Australian, a French Australian, there's a lot of engagement now in Paris and Berlin and in Brussels and in London on the big questions of global China strategy. Secondly, we need to ask ourselves this question: what was AUKUS supposed to achieve? That's the key question. If you look carefully at the AUKUS agreement, it essentially is a defence procurement agreement. It's not a military alliance, even though Mr. Morrison and Prime Minister Johnson sought to infer that it was. It's simply a defence procurement agreement. We already had defence procurement agreements with the UK and the US going back to the Second World War. Australia has always had preferential access to British and American military technology. Where the exception lay was in access to American nuclear propulsion technology. And that was, of course, a change in the specification. Which brings me to my third point. If the technical advice to the Australian Navy, Defence Force and government was that Australia had to change from the fleet of conventionally powered submarines that I specified in the 2009 white paper, and which Prime Ministers Abbott and Turnbull accepted after the change in government at the end of 2013, then what has materially changed in the technical specifications requiring now a nuclear-powered boat? Those specifications and changes may be valid. It's just they have not been made plain to the Australian public. That, I think, is the first question. The second is the massive delay that has now resulted through the cancellation of the French order of conventionally powered boats before the eventual placement of an order for nuclear-powered boats leaves Australia strategically naked without an effective submarine force for the next 20 years. This is not good, particularly given what we've just been discussing in terms of China's rising military challenge. That's my second critique. The third is the one that you've touched on specifically, which is why unnecessarily turn France from being a strategic partner into being a strategic adversary, which is what this diplomatic mismanagement of the French submarine deal has resulted in. Let's assume for the purposes of the argument, Albert, that the technical advice that we now need nuclear-powered boats is accurate, either because they are quieter, they require less exposure through not having to surface, and a range of other considerations which have yet to be made public to the wider Australian community. Let's assume, however, it's accurate. if you wanted to change the specifications effectively 3 to 4 years into a French project with Naval Group, why on earth did you not then directly communicate by letter with the French president and say, our technical specifications have changed, we now need nuclear-powered boats. Secondly, we understand, and the Naval Group also constructs nuclear-powered boats, which they do, and nuclear-armed boats, by the way. And thirdly, we're going to re-tender to Naval Group with the French and with the British and with the Americans. That way, you would have avoided the diplomatic insult to the French, which is we're just unilaterally cancelling this project. Secondly, you would have also avoided the clear evidence of bias towards the Anglo-Americans by extending the offer to tender to the French supplier as well. So I think on those 3 sets of measures, which is not being clear with the public about the changed security circumstances requiring nuclear-powered subs as opposed to conventionally powered subs. Secondly, leaving the Australian Navy defenceless, really, in terms of its submarine capabilities for 20 years. And then thirdly, the monumental and unnecessary diplomatic mismanagement with Paris. I think this has just been, frankly, incompetence. And I would have expected and hoped better of an Australian government.
Yes, I think that you could even go further and say that Australia could have simply sat down with the French and renegotiate for the French to supply a nuclear capable submarine, because the French definitely have that capacity. And they, you know, as the incumbent of the contract, in my view, that's what you do in business. You would sit down with your builder or whatever supplier and who has the contract and renegotiate with that person first. That's a common courtesy. I have to say that it's not, it doesn't have a good taste for Australia. I think that it is a mistake. There's no questions about it, in my view.
But it's evidence of a broader point, Albert, which is alive in our general conversation about China. My fear is that the current Australian government under Mr. Morrison actually does not care about Australia's international reputation. If they cared about our international reputation and how we're perceived in the world, you would not be so reckless on questions of climate change. You would not be so reckless in terms of dealing with the French. You'd not be so reckless in terms of your extravagant language about the Chinese, particularly from Minister Dutton. I think these things do not add up to a big concern for the current government, because their primary concern is always the electoral one, how to look as hairy-chested as possible in dealing with foreigners at large. The UN, the source of all evil on climate change. The French, now apparently the source of all unreliability and submarine supply. And the Chinese now, the source of all evil on everything. Now, that may all make up for an exciting political script domestically in dealing with your own right-wing political constituencies in an Australian election, but it is cumulatively damaging to the brand of Australia in the world, not just in Europe, not just in Asia, but also in America, where, as you said before, we now have the President of the United States effectively saying that Morrison, our Prime Minister, lied to the President of the United States. That is unprecedented. That has never been said before by an American president about any Australian Prime Minister in history.
So let's take a kangaroo jump. Let's jump from China to Iran. And have you heard the declaration by the Iranians in the last 48 hours that now they're declaring openly that they're pursuing a nuclear bomb?
No, I'm not. I haven't seen the most recent statement from Tehran. It doesn't surprise me for the simple reason that Iran's nuclear ambition has been consistent for decades now.
But now it's open and it's on the table, and all the while you've got Blinken and Sullivan waiting in an empty chamber in Vienna typing emails on their computers to their counterparts, European counterparts, not to their Iranian counterparts, and trying to do a deal through the Europeans with the Iranians for a deal that I think the name says it all. It's called less for less. Less compliance for less sanctions, or less sanctions for less compliance, whichever way you want to look at it. It is doomed to fail, is it not?
I am not sufficiently briefed on the current American negotiating position, but I will say in defense of John Kerry's negotiation of the JCPOA in the last year of the Obama administration, and having become relatively familiar with the content of that agreement, is that it did have the capacity to manage the problem of Iranian nuclear proliferation. I'm aware of the breakout risks. I'm aware of all the critique covered in many branches of the Israeli media. I'm aware of all the critique of that agreement from American Republicans. But short of a military action against Iran, that agreement, the JCPOA, negotiated with the full participation of the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese at the time, appeared to me to represent a reasonable effort to contain Iranian nuclear weapons proliferation. Secondly, would it have succeeded or not? Well, we never gave it time to work because Trump had already, in order to deal with his own constituency in the United States, indicated in the 2016 election that he would repeal it. If you asked Donald Trump to give you a description of the content of the JCPOA and what was inherently offensive about it, he could more easily recite the recipe to a McDonald's burger than he could to give you a description or a distillation of what was offensive within the JCPOA. It was not a perfect agreement. Nothing in diplomacy ever is. But here is the critical question. Surely it was better to give it an opportunity to work. And if it failed, then you've demonstrated to the international community, but most critically, both to Moscow and to Beijing, that Tehran could not be trusted under any circumstances because it had violated an agreement put in place with their participation as well. Now we're into a different world altogether, where as a consequence of the decision by President Trump to repeal the JCPOA unilaterally, effectively what we now see is Russia and China much more directly moving into Iran's strategic orbit. And that fundamentally worries me geostrategically. And certainly if our friends in Tel Aviv are now contemplating unilateral military action against Iran, and knowing the Israelis almost as well as you do, Albert, the bottom line is there is now a new dynamic at play, which will what will be the reaction out of Moscow and Beijing to any such unilateral action by Israel. So that's why I'm concerned about the absence of any diplomatic international legal constraints on Iran right now, and a simple recourse to military action. We're now in a different set of circumstances since Trump's unilateral decision to repeal the JCPOA in 2017.
I mean, there were many flaws in the JCPOA. There were loopholes that were left wide open for Iran to be able to claim that they were complying and at the same time continue their exploration of the bomb. Kevin, it was not that simple. But let's say that you are correct. We are in a situation here today where you are absolutely right. There is no mechanism. So to deal with the failure of this current negotiation, and it seems, of course, that the Iranians are applying maximum pressure because they declared at the same time that they declare openly now that they're pursuing the bomb, they say the IAEA is no longer welcome there. So that is therefore preempting what could come next, which is the Security Council at the UN be called and to discuss those matters. If they don't have the IAEA as an intermediary, The options are very, very limited. So in your opinion, what can happen, especially at the UN, if you call on the Security Council? What can they do?
The honest response right now, Albert, is that I'm deeply pessimistic. I think we had a chance with the JCPOA. I agree with you, it was flawed. As I said, all international agreements are flawed by their very nature, unless they're imposed unilaterally, in which case that was never going to happen with Iran in the absence of military action. And military action was ruled out by the United States and by Israel at the time because the consequences of military action would have been disproportionately dangerous. So in the real world of where we were in 2016, I still say it was the best of many bad options, the JCPOA. As for right now, can it be reconstituted in a vigorous fashion? If you're sitting with the regime and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRG in Tehran, their argument internally is this: if you agree to another JCPOA with this administration, if the Republicans win in 2024 in Washington, it'll be repealed again. What's the point? That's the problem. So I do not, for the moment, regard the Iranian regime as being virtuous on anything concerning Israel's national security needs. Not at all. But you're asking me an impossible question, which is what would you do now to try and reconstitute something which was fashioned 4 years ago, which has since been torn apart, when the ability to put it back together again is limited, and the ability to convince the Iranians that it wouldn't be pulled apart again is also limited.
Yeah, and fair enough. You've answered well. The situation is dire. And then there is an optimistic accord. We talked about accord being flawed, but the Abraham Accord seemed to work. You know that now you can travel to Tel Aviv. If we were to do that trip again, Kevin, we'd go to Dubai with Emirates, and then same Emirate would take us to Tel Aviv. I'd never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, but you can take a range of Arabian flights to Tel Aviv these days. And today there was an interesting outcome of the Abraham Accord. It just happened today or yesterday. I heard that Erdogan has declared that he wants to reestablish the diplomatic relations with Israel and with Egypt. And I think that that's a fallout of the Abraham Accord. So that's still, that has positive ramifications.
Yeah, I have also been a supporter of the Abrahamic Accords. And certainly in my long-standing engagement with the Gulf states, both as Foreign Minister and as Prime Minister of Australia, have long urged them to find a pathway through to normalisation with Israel. As you know, it's been a tortured path. There was an earlier stage when the UAE sought to normalise with Israel, and that was torpedoed by the actions by Mossad in conducting an assassination in Dubai, which had many.
I remember well with all the passports.
Right, with forged Australian passports, which had many implications, both here, but primarily in terms of the complete destruction of the normalization process between Israel and the UAE at that time. I know that for a fact because I spoke at length personally with the leadership of those countries, looking at the possibility of reconstituting something from the ashes of what occurred at the time. Anyway, as they say in the classics, that's history. The Abrahamic Accords, I think, in providing a pathway through for normalization between the UAE and of course Bahrain and Israel has been an enormously stabilizing development of the region. Now, friends in Tehran need to reflect deeply on the question of why. in the common strategic logic in Tel Aviv and in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai and in Manama is pretty simple, which is there's a common Iranian threat. That's what's brought these countries together. Secondly, I think the great opportunity it now presents is to build a wider economic region with increasingly seamless borders economically between these countries in the wider Middle East. And that's why it's so important still for our friends in Israel to be very mindful of how they manage the Palestinian question and the two-state solution in the long term. Irrespective of what the view within the Knesset may be of the two-state solution now, the bottom line is it remains the policy and the orthodoxy on the part of the UAE and the other Gulf states. And so any fundamental breach of the integrity of the two-state solution long term by any Israeli government will create fundamental fractures within the Abrahamic Accords. And that, I think, is very important for our friends in Tel Aviv and in the Israeli Knesset to be mindful of.
It's interesting because you are harsher with the Israelis on that point than the Arab themselves, because they understand the Palestinians and how stubborn they have been in terms of doing any accord whatsoever. Kevin, if an accord was on the table, and it has been many times, and if the Palestinians, if it was all about their autonomy and their people, that accord, in my view, would have been already signed. I don't know.
We respectfully disagree on that one, Albert.
We do, but we still.
And the reason I put to you in black and white is this: when Kerry produced such an accord at the end of 2016, with the support of the Palestinian side, Bibi Netanyahu rejected it. And I've had similar experiences myself in my own dealings with Bibi. So I think the prima facie proposition that Bibi and the then government were prepared to sign an accord on the final status questions, all five of them, I think is deeply challengeable. But let's just leave that. Let's leave that question to history. The second point you made is that the Arab states have a more sympathetic view of Israel's posture in the two-state solution than I do. That's not the case. I talk to the Arab states all the time. In fact, I traveled to the Middle East quite a lot, including to the Emirates. And I think many of our Israeli friends will be surprised at the levels of sensitivity still alive in the Arab world on this question. And therefore, again, I simply go back to a cautionary remark. I support the Abrahamic Accords, but Israel, in my judgment, should do nothing to so violate the two-state solution to the Palestinian question that it would then put in jeopardy the long-term political sustainability of all the advantages which flow from those Abrahamic Accords, not least concerning Tehran.
Yes, and as you know, the problem is super complex because whenever you talk about the Palestinians, you've got to distinguish between Hamas and the West Bank, etc. There's so many factions in there, and who is unifying them? You know that the last election took place in the territories 17 years ago. I'm not sure when the next elected representative will come to the fore. The last election earlier this year that Mahmoud Abbas had organized, he canceled them because he knew that Hamas would take over, and then went on accusing Israel of intermingling in the elections. I mean, it's a very difficult area, and pointing fingers at Israel is an easy thing to do. It's a thing that's done regularly, and I'm telling you, if you were the Prime Minister of Israel and if you could resolve this problem, we'd probably call you the Messiah. And A,
I'm not an Israeli, B, I'm not Jewish, and C, I'm definitely not the Messiah. I'm just a very naughty boy, as they say in the life of Brian. But but the bottom line is this. I've been around the Palestinian question, the two-state solution question, and the Iranian question, and the internal and external politics of the Gulf and throughout the Arab Spring in sufficient detail to understand how complex this is. It's very easy for Western politicians to roll into any Middle Eastern capital and provide a pre-baked solution. I never do that. And as you know, I've been a lifelong friend of Israel, and I am a supporter of the Abrahamic Accords, which is not a universal position in the West, as you know. But I think it's actually very good for Israel and very good for the Arab world. But it would be remiss of me not to simply underline this continued reality, which is the world has not simply become blind to the Palestinian question. The West has not become blind to the question of the two-state solution, and nor should Israel be blind to the implications for the future of the Abrahamic Accords if the two-state solution was to be formally extinguished for the future. That's my only point.
Thank you, Kevin. And I want to thank you for a very candid talk and to give me your very honest views. I've got another million questions to ask you, but time is really ticking. So it's been over an hour, and I don't want to abuse the friendship. And I simply say, I hope there'll be other occasions where we can continue this conversation.
Look forward to it out there. And again, my greetings to everybody in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in London, elsewhere in Australia, and to all of our friends, our mutual friends in the Jewish community as well.